This week's Torah portion is Vaira, or And I Appeared. A little while ago, I gave a message about one reason I believe in a creator. As a software engineer, I believe there's a necessity for designs to have designers. This week, I'd like to address a follow-up question I usually see.
Why the God of the Bible? There's a lot of historical and archaeological evidence to support the biblical accounts. Now, I won't be going into any of that with this commentary, but I recommend the site patternsofevidence.com as one source to check it out. Because of the accounts in this week's portion, I'm going to address another aspect of the question that I've heard on occasion. Isn't Christianity a copycat religion? I've heard similarities listed with pagan religions to conclude that the Bible isn't an actual historical account, but rather an updated account of previous religions. Here's one such article I found online, Parallels Between Christianity and Ancient Pagan Religions. Here are some examples from it. Similarities washed away a person's sins. God-man, aion. Baptism was a principal ritual. It washed away a person's sins. The most important sacrament was a ritual meal of bread and wine, which symbolized the God-man's body and blood. And similarities between other pagan religions and Christian practices. At Pentecost, the followers of Jesus were recorded as speaking in tongues. At Trophonius and Delos, the pagan priestesses also spoke in tongues. In Addis, a bull was slaughtered while on a perforated platform. The animal's blood flowed down over an initiate who stood in a pit under the platform. The believer was then considered to have been born again. Poor people could only afford a sheep, and so were literally washed in the blood of the lamb. This practice was interpreted symbolically by Christians. Now, this article gave some potential reasons for the similarities. One that I found interesting was Satan did it to deceive. Various early church writers such as Irenaeus, Justin Martyr, Tertullian concluded that the pagan Christian similarities were a satanic attempt at diabolical mimicry. Satan was said to have used plagiarism by anticipation. That is, the devil made a preemptive strike against the gospel stories centuries before Jesus was born. The reason was to confuse the public into thinking that Jesus was merely a copy of previous God-men. The goal was to demolish the credibility of Christianity in the people's eyes. Now, do we see this type of deception in Scripture? Let's go to this week's portion. Exodus 7:10. And Aaron cast down his rod before Pharaoh and before his servants, and it became a serpent. So God performed a miracle to demonstrate his power to Pharaoh. The magicians of Egypt, they also did in like manner with their enchantments. For every man threw down his rod, and they became serpents. But Aaron's rod swallowed up their rods. And Pharaoh's heart grew hard, and he did not heed them, as Yahweh had said. So the wise men and sorcerers copied God's miracle. When Pharaoh saw others able to do the same thing God did, he dismissed it and didn't respect God. They seem to have already known how to turn their rods into serpents. As the early church writers we just read about theorized, it's like their false gods, the demons, had prepared them to counterfeit God. And we see this pattern continue with the next few plagues. Verse 20, Aaron lifted up the rod and struck the waters that were in the river, in the sight of Pharaoh and in the sight of his servants, and all the waters that were in the river were turned to blood. Verse 22, then the magicians of Egypt did so with their enchantments, and Pharaoh's heart grew hard, and he did not heed them, as Yahweh had said. Pharaoh was again dissuaded when the magicians counterfeited God's miracle. It was a miraculous move by God, but when humans were able to do it, it didn't seem like that big of a deal to others. Exodus 8:6, Aaron stretched out his hand over the waters of Egypt, and the frogs came up and covered the land of Egypt. And the magicians did so with their enchantments and brought up frogs on the land of Egypt. Then Pharaoh called for Moses and Aaron and said, entreat Yahweh that he may take away the frogs from me and from my people, and I will let the people go, that they may sacrifice to Yahweh. So the magicians were able to copy God, but they weren't able to get rid of God's frogs. Moses and Aaron had to appeal to Yahweh to remove them. Verse 17, Aaron stretched out his hand with his rod and struck the dust of the earth, and it became lice on man and beast. All the dust of the land became lice throughout all the land of Egypt. Now the magicians still worked with their enchantments to bring forth lice, but they could not. So there were lice on man and beast. Then the magicians said to Pharaoh, "This is the finger of God." But Pharaoh's heart grew hard, and he did not heed them, just as Yahweh had said. God performed these miracles, but it wasn't until the magicians couldn't copy him when they finally acknowledged that it was God. But by this point, Pharaoh's heart was hardened such that he still wouldn't acknowledge God. So we see the idea of Satan creating counterfeits to discredit God is a definite possibility. It's an effective strategy because it not only leads some to dismiss Christianity altogether, it also causes Christians to accept pagan practices that aren't actually biblical. There were several examples in the earlier article that it didn't list because they're practices accepted by most of mainstream Christianity, but aren't actually anywhere in the Bible. And there are also other explanations for some of the similarities. I'd like to look at some excerpts from a Josh McDowell ministry article, Is Christianity Unique or Copycat Religion? The charge that Christianity plagiarized from surrounding pagan religions came to the fore in the late 19th century, becoming prominent in academic circles at the turn of the 20th century. Though this notion has largely been rejected by the academic community because historical facts don't support it, it lingers as a vague idea in popular culture. It's a popular argument that mythicists, scholars focus on debunking the historicity of the Bible like to promote. Yet do their charges of Christ the copycat hold up? Nope. When one takes the time to study the similarities they suggest, it's quickly apparent that the differences are actually much greater than any commonalities. Some of the pagan deities they compare to Jesus include Isis, Osiris, and Horus, which originated in Egypt. 2, the cult of Adonis, which rose in Syria and Palestine, and Mithra, which started in Persia or Iran, but was widely practiced across the Roman Empire. Here's the truth. Although these pagan religions are historically earlier than Christianity, scholars have uncovered almost no historical record of what these religions believed before Christianity. Almost all of the earliest writings of these cults date from the 3rd and 4th centuries AD. So a lot of these similarities may have been added in after Jesus already had his ministry. Those claiming a link between Mithra and Jesus talk about the baptism that initiated prospects into the Mithra cult. But what was it actually? Mithraic priests would place initiates into a pit, suspend a bull over the pit, and slit the bull's stomach, covering the initiates in blood and gore. Such a practice bears no resemblance whatsoever to Christian baptism, a person going underwater symbolizing the death of Christ, and then coming back out of the water symbolizing Christ's resurrection. So they're drawing similarities there that really don't exist. Mythicists propose that Mithra shared many commonalities with Christ. Both were birthed from virgins, both were miracle-working teachers accompanied by 12 disciples, both died, were buried in tombs, and resurrected 3 days later for the benefit of the world, and both were hailed as the way, the truth, and the light. In actuality, there were 3 versions of Mithra, and not one of them left behind ancient writings outlining the cult's beliefs. Historians have only been able to piece together bits of the religion using secondhand sources and inscriptions. In the Roman version of the cult, Mithra was born not of a virgin, but sprang from a rock. In other versions, he was created as an adult. No proof exists that he had disciples, and there's no evidence of his self-sacrifice. And there's no indication in any version that Mithra resurrected. Neither is there evidence to support their claims that Jesus and the Egyptian god Horus shared these proposed commonalities: 12 disciples, crucifixion between 2 thieves, and resurrection. We can also blast apart supposed similarities with Krishna, Attis, Dionysus, and other mythic gods. The deities of these pagan religions weren't real people. They were mythical characters created to explain aspects of everyday life. In contrast, Christianity tells the story of Jesus, which history documents as having literally existed, just as the Bible tells us. All during his ministry, Jesus said and did things that reinforced his claim that he is the Son of God. When scores of witnesses saw his resurrected form, they believed and spread the word. The four Gospels, written by his disciples or person who intimately knew them, give us minute details of Christ's ministry, both before and after his death. We see the heart of God and what's important to him. Chiefly among them, that we would know that he loves us so much that he was willing to be the ultimate sacrificial lamb. Shabbat Shalom.